anybody else joined us, that's cool. When we were doing our adult ed, laying out plans for the year, we decided this is a class that is essential because I think we've been talking about telling people read the Bible, but then we forget to equip people on how to read the Bible, right? So we have a Bible which is the most purchased book ever and the least read book ever. So like to have both ends of the continuum right smack dab in one book makes me think we just haven't equipped people for the journey, right? So we're going to talk about some practical ways of going about starting the journey, how you can get into a Bible, and then next week we're going to do some, if we have time today we'll do it, but we're actually going to do some practices with reading the Bible. And now obviously I know you all can read, I'm going to make that assumption, I think it's fair, but there's something a little bit different about reading the Bible and just being able to read. Because there's something very intimidating about this particular book, right? How many of you, and this isn't because I'm going to judge you, how many of you actually make a habit of reading the Bible? Okay. So several people, since we made the announcement last year about downloading the app, I have, let me see if I pull it up here.
Not down here, probably.
Oh, actually, it came up. I was thinking the same thing. It came up. So there's the Bible app. That's a free YouVersion app for anybody that has a smartphone. And every day, my Bible verse of the day pops up. So before I even get out of bed, I see that, and the last thing that my phone tells me every night is, remember to read your Bible plan, the 100-day plan that Pastor Jim started. So there's ways to like incorporate it into things that are part of our regular life now. But before we even begin, I'm going to just chat with you a little bit about how this Bible even came to be. I'll take one of these. This is our Lutheran Study Bible. This covers hundreds, if not thousands of years of history. Now, if anybody ever kept a diary as a kid, we'd have them this thick over after 1 year. So if we really knew every ounce of everything that happened in a life according to the years, we wouldn't have enough space in our world for those books. So we have to recognize that the 66 books that made it into this Bible, which is called the canon, must have a purpose. Even the little guys, like the ones that nobody ever reads, right? Habakkuk or Ezra, things like, some of them we don't even know what they are. They all have a purpose, which means we shouldn't just read the 4 books of the gospel. And in our preaching, because we use something called the Revised Common Lectionary, we often just preach the gospel. And we're doing a disservice to 2/3 of the book, which is the Old Testament. And the Old Testament has such rich history to lead us up to the New Testament that we kind of need to preach on that, or at least learn it as well. So the Bible is 66 individual books. There's an Apocrypha, which some Bibles have the Apocrypha, which are books that didn't really make it into the 66 original books, like the Maccabees. There's a whole other book about Esther in here that gives a little bit extended version. Tobit. You might not even recognize some of these names. These are other books that somebody along the line thought they're important enough to put in, but we don't have them in the regular Bibles. Okay? The Bible, the Old Testament, there's 2 testaments. Testaments are promises. The first covenant or promise was written to the Jewish people, the Israelites. And the second promise is obviously to the Gentile people who are now considered the chosen people as well. This book, if we pretend this was a pot of chicken soup, right? And we put it in, there's going to be like some stuff that surfaces that you can scrape off. That you go, what? Why are there 2 stories of creation? Why are there 2 stories of Noah? Why are there 2 stories of anything if this is the Word of God? Why is that necessary? So those are called doublets. And they happen because at some time, because we now live in a society that has church and state separate, but that wasn't always the case. And so if a ruler joined forces with another ruler, they often wanted their story to be in where the other ruler wanted their story, so they just compromised. They put both stories. So a lot of the times you'll come across things and you're like, what is that? Why is that there? So instead of, there's many, many traditions that believe every single word is inerrant. But if you get to chapter 2 of Genesis, you have to question that because they're already, right out of the gate, there's challenges. But the important part to remember, if you boil it all down, Maybe you scrape off the fat off the chicken soup. You're going to have some good potatoes or carrots or celery, that matter. But what really is left is one word, and that's love. And so that's the meat and potatoes of it, is that this is a love story about God after his chosen people. So you'll notice from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, it's very cyclical. And you can even see it today in our own culture. The rulers or the culture is all about God. And then they start to pull away from God. And then they start to do things their own way, and then you have collapses of empires, and then they rebuild to go back to focusing on God. And it starts at the very beginning, and it continues on throughout the whole book. And that's what it's all about, this story of us needing redemption, and God being the Redeemer. So when you look at it through the lens of love, it changes the way you read it. Because how many of you have ever read some of the stories in the Old Testament and you're like, this is gory? Right? My dad and I used to challenge each other who could read the whole Bible first in a year. And often he would try to go front to back. And I'm like, Dad, you're never going to get through it. You're going to get to like Leviticus and you're going to be bored to tears, or you're going to go, this book is gruesome. And often he would say, he's like, I can't read it. Like, that's not the God I want to envision, a God that like wipes out 200,000 people at once. So the reality is you have to recognize why we have those big dramatic stories. And it's all based on the need for God to love his people and to redeem his people. When you get to the New Testament, you don't see the same types of really horrific, wiping out of entire cultures. And that's because of the Messiah coming. So before I even start to read, there's a couple of things I do. I have a little cheat sheet, and I'll pass it out with notes. Next week, I have a list. I wanted to kind of see how many are here before I make copies, because there's a lot of pages to it. Somebody was patient enough to go through the entire Bible and write the stories in chronological order. Because if you read this book from front to back, it's not chronological order. Right? In fact, Genesis isn't even first.
Well, there is a Bible, a chronological Bible.
Mm-hmm. Max Lucado did one, and they wrote it in there's a couple of them. He did one, and it's called The Story. And they made it into a narrative. There are some chronological Bibles. First of all, what you're going to see, I brought you a sampling of Bibles. There's so many Bibles now. First of all, the Bible is translated into over 2,000 languages. And there's more Bibles than I have room for. I just brought you a sampling. So before you start, whenever I pull out a Bible, I always think to myself, I don't know enough to teach myself. But the Holy Spirit gives us faith. So before you begin, ever, what do you think the first thing you should do? Pray. And that's always what I tell people, because often I will watch, when I work with the kids in particular, they're like, I don't even know where to start with this. I'm like, don't worry, neither do adults. But if you pray, then you know that the Spirit will give you the wisdom, because God promises us when we seek after Him, He'll give us the knowledge. The next particular thing I think that's important is you have to figure out what translation works for you. How many of you grew up with King James? All right, so a little story behind King James. He was the king, obviously, and the Bible was being translated, and he wanted his to get out first. So he hired the scribes to get to working on it, and rush. And what you'll notice in the King James Version, it sounds very poetic, but there's actually more errors in translation than most other books. So it's technically not the best translation of the Bible, but people who grew up with it will fight you on that. Herb Hildebrand. Anybody know Herb? Yeah. I know. Herb will take it on if you ever challenge that question, because he believes that it's the finest translation. Most of it comes from the familiarity of it.
Yeah, that's odd here in that, particularly right this moment, there are a gazillion versions of the King James Bible being produced. Is there a rationale for that?
I think it's because people love the sound of that, like thou shalt not kill. It's something that we are familiar with. So the people redoing them are trying to take that same traditional language and bringing it into a present day. So when we go over to Glacier Hills at Christmas, they ask us to only read the King James Version, because there's something so like a homecoming
Well, there's
hear that.
1,000 of these.
And for me, I sometimes read it and I'm like, I don't know what I just read. Like, I really can't even translate in my brain. And that's what I dealt with as well. So, it doesn't matter, like, if you love King James, Barbara, read King James, right? There are some people who love the Message. Now, the Message is technically a paraphrase. Some people hate this. Some people have gone as far as saying this is sacrilegious. But if it speaks to you, then read this one. We have very specific poverty and justice Bibles, right? I have one, a women's Bible commentary. It's actually a Bible with all commentary inserted from a female perspective, right? This one is by Carol Newsom, Sharon Ringe, and Jacqueline Lapsley. Then I have this one. This is the African Bible commentary. And this gives you a perspective from Africa, not African Americans, from Africa. Because depending on what your context is, you're going to read the Bible differently than other people. The prodigal son, we're going to do a little activity if we have time with the prodigal son story today. We all hear that story differently. And the bishop's right, it's very familiar, it's part of our fabric as Christians. But we all hear something different in that. And depending on what your social context is, what your social construct, where you grew up, what you know the world as, you're going to read all of the Bible differently. Okay? So, this is a newer version one. This is called the CEB, the, what's it stand for again? The Christian Standard Bible, I think it is.
Common English Bible.
Oh, this one's the Christian Standard. What's that?
There's a Common English Bible.
There's a Common English, CEB is a Common English. There's an ESV, English Standard Version. There's so many different versions. You're going to get, every theologian you talk to will tell you differently what they think the best is. Because it's a personal choice. So my take is, the reason I brought a bunch and put them out is I want you to peruse and say, which one actually speaks to me? So the way I do it, I choose one verse, and then I read it in several different verses, and I say, like, this is what's speaking to me today. I tend to do NSRB, because that's what I was schooled in.
But did they put together the Lutheran study Bible from the perspective of Luther?
Sure. So you got that one too, right here. And the cool part about the Lutheran study, actually any study Bible, what's nice is they have notes in the sides, right?
Does it have to say study Bible to figure
For the notes, typically. So this one is called, this is one that I was taught in, and they have just about as many notes as they do Bible, right? And so here's what I would recommend, being a Lutheran. I like the Lutheran Bible because it's going to have a Lutheran take. The NIV, those big thick brown ones we often see, they have a very conservative bent to their notes. So you have to recognize who's the author. Now we know God's the author, but who's the author of the notes? They're just men and women writing these things. So I never read a commentary or a Bible translation without doing a little bit of homework to know why. Like, who is this? What's the take?
I also have a parallel Bible. It's got 4 versions at once.
That's awesome.
Compare that.
Does it have that just lines it right up?
Yeah, I have it on my iPad, and just took the different versions and see how the verses line up.
And I love that. The YouVersion Bible, which is why I like this so much, is because you can compare all sorts of versions with one swipe of the finger. When I have a newbie, somebody who's new to the faith, I often give them a children's Bible. And not because it looks kiddie, but because they lay out things in a little bit more concrete way. Like they'll give some examples in those little blurbs that is much more real life than even some of our study Bibles. So it's all the same words, but sometimes this is more like a teen Bible, but some of the even like younger Bibles give like a science experiment. It makes it practical. It makes it real life. So those are some options. Before we go on, we're going to do a little activity. So the Old Testament was written in what language? Anybody remember? Hebrew. New Testament? Greek. Sometimes Arabic, Latin. There's some other, but mostly Greek. Hebrew is the Old Testament. And when I learned Hebrew, which is it's like learning a big logic game. One of the things that we were taught to do is to do exegesis, which is then you take a passage of the Bible in the original language, not in English and going back and forth, and then you have to translate it. And then you can read any version to see how close you came. And what I learned is, everybody, if we would have been in a group this big, we'd all have something pretty different, or some similarities, but one or two words could be different. So we're going to do a little example, okay? To kind of teach you a little bit. Alan, you help me pass these out, just one to each person. I have pencils and pens, and we're going to do some examples on the board. One pencil or pen. I'm going to just take one of those and pass it around. Here's some of these. All right. Anybody know some of the nuances with Hebrew?
No.
No vowels.
No vowels.
It's right to left instead of left.
And it's right to left.
Yeah.
Oh, I know one, actually.
Do you have pencil? Yeah, I'll take it.
Because we have one.
Oh, I was thinking of that.
All right. This is a toughie. See if you can figure out what this actually says. You can't see it?
Your board a little.
Let me write it bigger.
Yeah,
There you go.
that's okay.
That's fine.
I'll write it bigger and
That's one word or?
it's a sentence.
Jesus saves, Moses confesses.
No? You can write it down when you think you have it. I'll give you 3 of them.
We go from right to left, correct?
Yep. Everything is read this way and there are no vowels.
Oh, I was in that way. Welcome to translation.
What is the second line then?
So this is one sentence, this is the second sentence.
Oh,
These are,
two different
you get 2 guesses.
What book is it from?
The book of Vicky. It's not a Bible, there's just sentences. There's nothing,
It's not
It's
necessarily
not the Bible.
biblical sentences.
right.
I get Jesus.
You got Jesus, all right. So do our answers down here. So, yes, I'll give you Jesus is the first word for here. It's a little bit harder than it seems, right?
Yeah.
Some.
Is, if anybody gets this one,
Homeboy.
yes! You realize this yes. Too.
Oh, that's
Wow, that's pretty good.
All right, how about this one?
The Bible?
Yep, the Bible.
The Bible is true. No.
The Bible.
The Bible is great.
It's great.
The Bible is great. Yep. All right, so you can see that it's not as easy as you would think, right? All right, let's go with a common one. How about this? If I have, what are some words that could be with HT?
Heart.
Heart? Well, there'd be an R in there.
Hit.
Hit.
Hot.
Hot.
Hat.
Hate. Hat. Heat. All from just those 2 symbols. So could there be room for inerrancy?
Yes.
Possibly, right? So we read, when I was in my exegesis class, we did a passage in Exodus about when they had handmaids come in their house, what do they call it when they do, midwives, and they delivered a baby. And the way it was phrased is if they were Hebrew midwives, it changed the story. If they were the midwives of the Hebrews, then they were the ones that like lied and didn't tell that they were delivering the baby, the boys. Were they doing it because they were Hebrews protecting them, or were they not Hebrews? Were they Egyptian women that knew the power of God? And it changed the entire way the story is read based on whether you read it as Hebrew midwives or midwives of Hebrews. With doing some sort of translation like this, you recognize how hard it is to get it perfect. Hebrew linguists that do this for a living argue about these kinds of things. So this emphasizes my point why we need to pray for the knowledge, right? Because the reality is nobody has it 100% right. So I always start my lessons with that to caution you that before you really go to your grave over a particular verse, recognize there might be challenges. There's room for interpretation. Okay? Before I begin, there's a few things I always do. If I have a new person I'm going to share the Bible with, where would you suggest I go? Start with Genesis? John. Definitely Leviticus. You go right to A lot of people say John. Why would you say John?
Because it's the love story. It's the whole essence is right there of Jesus.
And it starts in the very beginning and it goes. It was, it is, it always will be. A lot of people start with John. I've read many commentators who believe in Matthew being the first one. Why Matthew, do you think?
It's the first one. It's the first one in the New Testament.
It is the first one in the New Testament.
It establishes the lineage of Jesus, if that's of importance to whoever's reading.
It could be. Matthew has almost all of Mark in it. So Mark's like the Cliff Note version of the Gospels, right? It's quick, it's practical, it's to the point. Matthew has all of that, and then some. Matthew talks more about the stories. So Matthew was geared towards an audience of Jewish people, and they were trying to prove Jesus was the Messiah. So what they did that through storytelling. So if you have somebody that you know who enjoys stories, because then you can apply it to your life, like the prodigal son, then that might be a good place to start, because it's loaded with it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels. And you're going to see very similar stories in all three. Now, why is Luke a little bit more attention to detail, do you think?
Christmas.
He is the only one with the birth story. And he was a physician. So we hope physicians pay attention to details. Do physicians pay attention to details, Doc? We hope so, right? So he paid attention to details in a different way. And then you have John, which is often called the spiritual gospel. I love John. The more I grow in my faith journey, John becomes something that really speaks to me. Because it's more about God's divine son, versus proving Jesus is the Messiah. It's just saying, like, look how much I love you, I've done this for you. It's just a different way of going about it. But the Gospels are a great place to start. Have you ever seen the Bibles? They're about this thick, and they're just New Testament. Those are often given out to seekers and new people, but I always caution for those of us that are in the church, don't only read the New Testament. You will be missing out on the gift of the Old Testament, which is such a beautiful part of our historical essence of this book that we need, okay? In our exploring, if you will, we have different books here at Zion. In classroom B, I think, right in the middle, I was just looking around there this morning. These are just sitting there. Like, help yourself and use them and study. Making sense of scripture, like David Lose, he's a well-known guy. Opening the Bible, what's in it, where did it come from, what's it mean? And then these basic guys. I will always say when you open a book of the Bible, ask yourself, who is this written to? Like, what was the context behind it? Have you ever just jumped into a conversation and you're like, ooh, I totally had that read wrong, right? Because you start contributing like, that's not what we're talking about. We do that with scripture all the time. We dive in and we think we know what's going on and we've missed out on a whole backstory. So the nice part about study Bibles will often give you a beginning. For example, this particular study Bible, it tells you what's going on in Genesis. It gives you a little outline so you know what to expect, because it doesn't just launch you in unknowingly. The NIV ones actually tells you all the characters' names, what's going on in their lives. It gives you background knowledge. If you don't have that, you're going to be only reading half the story. So I always say, what's the context? The other thing to keep in mind, we often read the Bible in a very serious tone. Like God's speaking to us, so we have to be very reverent. Do you know there's comedy in this? Like,
Talking donkeys.
talking donkeys, it's kind of funny, right? The whale, Jonah, the book of Jonah, is actually a tongue-in-cheek funny story. But we read it very seriously. It's not. That's one of the stories I'm hoping that we actually get to read because it's kind of short. I want you to recognize there's genres in here, okay? So I pulled out, there it is. So you need to know what the context is, and you need to know the genre. So this is a simple poster I've used for years, so it's kind of kooky. But it helps you to understand that the Bible is not all narrative. It's not all, it's different. Like, if you want to have something poetic, go to one of the books of poetry. If you want to hear the history, go to the historical pieces. But look at all the different genres in this one particular book. There's one Bible made up of 66 parts. It's important for you to recognize that our God is creative, and there's going to be humor. There's going to be tragedy. There's going to be sadness. There's going to be joy. All of it's going to be in there. In fact, go to read Song of Solomon. That's like the kinky stuff of the Bible, right? Like there's even that. So I often tell newlyweds, you want first Valentine's Day, get out a bottle of wine, some chocolate, and read Song of Solomon to each other. You'll be surprised. And it's right, it's there because God recognizes we're sexual beings as well as these creatures that He gave us all of these emotions. And it's all in here. And you know, you get the new parents who say, I wish there was an instruction book. There is, it's right here, right? So I'll leave this out in case you want to look at it. But you have to recognize, like, there's all of this beautiful stuff come together. So when you're saying, all right, I'm going to read today Ephesians. What's Ephesians about? Well, Ephesians, to give you a hint, what town do you think it was written to, this letter? Ephesus. And you can always start, like, if you want to read any of the letters, you know that there's a book, it's the letters, and I'll read you a little beginning so that you always know it. It always starts out the exact same. I have Romans right here, so I'll just read that one. A rich theological salutation, a review of, oh wait, that's the second part. Hang on, let me use that first part. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which He promised beforehand through His prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning His Son, blah, 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 through whom He received grace and apostleship, including yourself, belong to Jesus. So he first starts out with, who's writing? Then the second part, to all God's beloved people in Rome. That's the citation. Just think of like how you learned in elementary school how to write a letter, right? And then it always goes, grace to you and peace from God our Father. So you know that this is a letter. Right out of the gate I can say, all right, Paul is writing to Rome. Why is he writing to Rome? Give yourself some context. What's happening in Rome at the time? These study Bibles go on to tell you what's going on there. But Rome was the most powerful place at the time, right? So we had Paul sent to Rome probably to talk about some of the junk that's going on with their power. Maybe they're being their own gods, right? You can, even if you don't know the history, you can kind of put pieces together as you read it. If you go on to Corinthians, in Corinthians, they're actually having orgies in the church, in the temples. They're probably with their hands slapped, I think, right? So when you start to read some things that are like harsh, like, ooh, watch out, they sound like threats a little bit, you need to know what the behavior was going on at the time. So context is key, but then you need to say to yourself, all right, that's what's happening then. How does this apply to me now? How does this apply now? What am I hearing from God for me today? I'm all about reading the Bible, but if you don't apply it till now, you have no context for it to link onto, and it'll go in one ear and out the other. So you have to take whatever you're reading and say, how does this impact me now? If you don't, this is just from being a teacher for 20 years. If you don't make it matter to you at the moment, you won't learn it. So that's why, like, you'll notice every time I preach, I always bring it home. Like, what's it mean today? How does this impact us now? I always do that. Because it's really important for you to walk away with knowledge. It has to impact you personally. So,
And it works in the reverse too. Every passage you read, you can apply it to something that's going on in your life today.
which is why it's considered timeless, right?
Right.
So that's what makes the Bible, to me, the most amazing book. Like, how could it be 2,000 years ago, and it does work both ways? How is that even possible, right? It's amazing. So here are some of these. We're going to do a little activity with this. All right. You guys, let you guys take that test down. So it's just a recap of what I was saying. We talked about Bible basics, being that the Bible is made up of a bunch of different genres. It's 2 covenants put into one. There's 66 books. We have 4 gospels that we focus way too much attention on. No, I'm not kidding. We focus a lot of attention necessarily, but there's a whole bunch of other good stuff. I just emphasized here about choosing the translation that you enjoy. The one we use in church is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, and that's probably because most pastors are schooled with that, and really it's probably out of our comfort zone versus the congregations, to be quite honest. I gave you some of the most common versions that are there, but there's a slew of others. I pointed out the Gospels, who the audiences are, reminding you here about context, and then we're at number 4. Here's the key. Start small. If you've never been a daily Bible reader, just start small. You do not have to sit down and read for an hour a day. It would be awesome if you get to that. You're right, it would be fantastic. But for some of us, that's just not going to happen. So start somewhere. What I love about the YouVersion Bible app, and I use that as a reference a lot because they've made it so easy for us. They have these little plans. And you can choose any of these plans, and if you click on the plan, they actually have a devotion and some short little verses you read, all 10 minutes. But you're feeding yourself, and you're in the Word, and you're with God. And so you can keep going. Like, you don't have to stop there. If you choose to just read on your own without a plan, I always suggest to do something from the Old Testament, something from the New, and then something from either the Psalms or Proverbs. It's kind of like, oh, here's the Old Testament that scares people off. Here's the hope of the New Testament, and then there's some beauty in it. That's how the one-year Bible is laid out. And there's a reason why it was laid out that way. There's lots of one-year Bibles. One's called Eat This Book, and that just takes you right through from cover to cover. I don't recommend cover to cover.
Right.
I think most people poop out because they get bored. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, in the past, I tried to read the Bible sequentially, and it just, you get bogged down in the
Yeah.
Deuteronomy and Leviticus and there. I doing this 100-day plan on the U Bible.
Yeah.
And it's great. It goes sequentially through the Bible, but it just picks out major stories. And you were talking about how cyclical things are. You read the same stories about the Israelites pleasing God and doing things, and then they drift away, and then we get a new prophet, and it goes. Anyway, the first 50 days is the Old Testament, the second 50 days is the New Testament, and it's really
that's exactly how it's laid out.
and as you say, it's just a few minutes each day.
But you're always connected then.
Yeah, it's great.
And it doesn't have to be, a lot of people start in the morning, because before the sun rises, there's something holy about that moment. Do whatever works for you. For me, some of my best Bible time is driving. I love it, right? Like, me sitting, I don't know, the morning is not gonna work for me. I'm gonna be like, oh, what do I have to do? Like, I know that. So, do what works for you. And it's kind of nice when you do it with another person. That doesn't work in my family. I talk too much apparently. My husband doesn't like to study the Bible with me. details, you asked so many questions, and I just wanna like get through it and like dwell on it. I love dwelling on it. I'm gonna teach you 2 practices of, sitting with the Bible. So there's 2 main ways of getting through the Bible. One is to like just read it to get through it, right? To say, I read the Bible. But then the other part is to actually take your time reading it and dwelling in it and sitting with it. And then this is more the listening to the Bible, hearing what the Bible is saying to you. One is active, we're reading it to get through it. One is sitting and letting it kind of move in our hearts. And there's different spiritual practices. If you went on Google and you put in how to read the Bible, you get 100 different people telling you the best way to do it. You have to do what works for you. But I will say the moments that are, that we allow us to hear what the Bible is saying by sitting in it is probably when you'll feel the most connected to God.
But our church has two.
Awesome.
Right.
We have all different kinds like that.
Yep, and so I just assumed this is what the church, because it does tend to follow the church year also. And a new one starts tomorrow.
Yeah, these are great. These little portals and prayers. We provide all these materials to try to make it easy for you. And for some people, that's great. Like I toss one of those in my purse, so I have it with me. I'm a digital age, so I'd rather my phone. But a lot of people, when we go on visits, we bring those everywhere. Yeah, and they do go along with the church year, which is
And
nice.
they have good prayers for visiting the sick in the hospital and lots of other help items.
Absolutely.
To deal with the community area.
Yeah, upstairs on, in the welcome area, there's large print and small print if those appeal to you. Yes. Okay, we're gonna take, let me say this. When we read it as a continuing narrative, a continuous story, right? Because it is a love story. When we do that, this is what you're gonna follow. There's like a storyline to it. You get creation, and then the fall, and then redemption, and restoration. That's the cycle, right? And if you look at it, that's what we see right out of the gate, but look in your own life. How many times has something new happened in your life, and then all of a sudden, shoot, that didn't really work out for you, and you need to be redeemed a little bit, maybe for your own mistakes, and then God restores the plan. And we see this story, not just with the Garden of Eden. This is our life. And this is what we see when we read the Bible front to back. But then we can also look at it as a collection of like different theological perspectives. And that would be more or less taking a nugget and dwelling on it and thinking about it. So I have this theme here. These are 4 themes you're going to see. You'll see the theme of God, God the Father. You'll see the theme of sin, because we of course, that's there. Then you have the theme of Christ coming in as a Messiah, and then our faith in the journey. And so you'll see, as we study little nuggets, we focus on themes more as opposed to like a whole giant story. But there's lots of different ways. I think that if you walk away from anything today, no, there's no wrong way to read the Bible. And usually it's just get over your fear of thinking you don't know enough and dive into it. Okay? So we're going to start today with the story we heard upstairs. The prodigal son. We could read it again, but I won't, for lack of time, we won't. How is the prodigal son like today?
Separation from God, and then reuniting.
Separation from God, so again, like a fall, redemption, and then restoration with that family. Think about the story of, we can do each character. The son who gets his inheritance and he splits. What are some ways that we split? Like, what are some ways that we live a life like
I
this?
heard once that the average person who gets an inheritance spends it in 7 months. Isn't that awful?
That's a horrible thought.
Yeah, that's a horrible
Makes
thought.
me want to spend all my money right now.
Yeah, it's all gone within 7 months.
Oh, that's terrible. So what
That's kind of what happens to everybody. Then you have to start over again.
Well, you know, we do see this sometimes with, you bring your kids to church, you get them first communion, you get them confirmed, and then they disappear. And it's like, as a parent, you could say, well, I did my job, I got them through the 8th grade and they're confirmed, and now it's on them. But it's one of those, well, I got what I needed all at the beginning, and now I'm good. So you could use that as an example.
Very much so. And we may not all be hanging out with prostitutes or hanging out on a pig farm, but what are other ways that we're like enjoying life away from God? It might not be much. I mean, now I was thinking as the bishop was preaching today, I'm like, oh, I could see like a video or a movie coming from this. Because how often do we think we're just living a nice life, right? But Sunday's my only day to sleep in. Or, you know, I'd much rather take my family on vacation than like give my tithe that month. Or like think about the little corners we cut. And we all do it without even thinking of it. But those little corners become our one step away from God, each corner we take. And before you know it, like we're living a life that's all about our material existence or our own greed or our own self-preservation. And that technically is what happened with that guy. So it's easy to look at that character and go, well, I haven't slept with a prostitute, or I haven't, you know, gone and gambled away my money, or I haven't done that. But when you look at it as of today, how today are you that character? So that's one way. It's a very Ignatian way of reading the Bible, is you put yourself in the place of the character. So when you read that story and you do it, it kind of makes you feel a little dirty, right? You're like, oh, I guess I am a little guilty. Then if you put yourself in the place of the older brother. I mean, sometimes you ever feel like, oh, I go to church all the time, why are bad things still happening? Do we ever get that perspective of like, I'm a good person, look how much fun they're having, they're like going out and living their life, they don't think about God. And we get a little bit like, so when you start to play around with the characters, it takes on a different meaning. Now you're gonna go to a next level. If you want to get like all teachery about it, it's like a higher order of thinking. Right. Which means you're then going to assume the knowledge differently. So then you can think of how the dad was. You know, like in that culture, the men wouldn't have shown their legs. That man saw his kid, he whipped up his dress, and he went running down with his legs hanging out. He didn't care, he was so ecstatic. So I know, as a pastor, one of the things a lot of middle-aged families say to me is, my kids have left the church. If your kids start coming back to church, would you pick up your dress and run at that kid? Absolutely. So now you can put yourself in those shoes. So regardless of what the story is, even if you're like, I can't really connect with the king that just killed his mother, right? I mean, if you have those things, you're like, but you can go, okay, let's look at it figuratively. How have I hurt somebody? How many of you went and saw Not Able to Love Her the other night when she was speaking? And I know there's a few of us in here that did. I'm reading her book right now, and she mentioned this the night when we were there. She said Martin Luther had a way of doing the commandments where he didn't just say, thou shalt not kill. It was the opposite. Thou shalt not kill, but thou should be lifting our neighbor. You know, thou shalt not commit adultery, but you should have concern for your partners. And it was just a beautiful way of saying, it's not enough for me just not to kill you. How am I elevating you? So in essence, like, we're the bad guy in every story as well as the good guy. So you can literally put yourself in the place of every person for every story. Yeah?
What about the younger brother's position? Like, you know, you can say, oh, he was hopeless, but the story gives you hope because the father is like God, you know, he's always going to welcome you back, you know, no matter how bad he's in.
So we have the creation. The son was obviously created. He falls away. He's redeemed, and now there's restoration. So you see that whole cycle. I'll put it up here in case you want to write in your notes. So there's always creation. And this goes back to even what I was saying, how the Bible is very cyclical. You can just replace the different words. And we have redemption, and then we have restoration. And in the middle of all this is the love of God. And so that's why we can look at all this whole Bible, as intimidating as it looks. Even sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I want to tackle that one today. But then I remember, if the gist of it is love, that's easy. Right? Like, okay, I can figure out love. So then I can look through every one of these stories and say like, how is God's love showing through here? And I can reframe it. So my suggestion is if you take, you know how some people say, I just open the Bible and I just point and I figure this is what God's saying to me today. And then, oh, that's probably not what he really meant. We all do that, right? Let's try not to do that. So when we do that, you have to be careful, because you gotta go like, what's the context? What is this? Am I even like the type of person fitting into this? Well, I guess maybe I am. So then let's figure it out. And so then you can read it and you look at it. So ask questions when you read the Bible, right? You can't just take it all at face value and think you have it figured out. This Bible is one that I had a class. It was called Genesis to Revelation, and I actually have the DVDs now upstairs that I'd love to show. It was one of the best things I've ever seen. Yeah, it was just, this guy, Craig Hester, is probably one of the best. He's just an amazing professor. Anyway, he took it through, and he took us on a pictorial journey through the Bible, and then he cross-referenced. So what was fascinating to me is how many times I would read a story, say, in 1 Kings, and because we don't really know our Bible, it's also referenced like back here, and another story back here, and then it's listed in Psalms, and you start to see these threads. But unless you go and like do a little bit of homework, you don't even know that it's that cool. Because we're like, oh, that's page 512, and then it's again back here in page 2000. No. That's like 700 years or 1700 years. That makes it really amazing. And so when you start to recognize the beauty of all of that, it makes it fun to dive in and put the pieces together. So sometimes in these study Bibles, it'll say, like this one, see also Joshua 6:18, right? It'll give you the references. So if you're new to reading the Bible, get a Bible that is a study Bible, because it'll help you see that cool stuff. We were preaching in Garden Grove one week, and Nathan was sitting in the back, and I got done, and he's like, I know exactly what that was. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he starts quoting scripture at me, and I'm like, no, I read out of this, it was a gospel reading. He's like, no, go to Isaiah, I'm promising you. And sure enough, there it all was, and it just was like something from his memory bank that popped out, and I said, isn't that what makes scripture beautiful? Like, it's just this beautiful tale that keeps going. So, this little bit that I gave you today is just a starting point. I'm going to suggest you like put that in a Bible, if you will. Next week when we come back, if you choose to come back to this class, we're going to be doing Lectio Divina. If you've ever done Lectio Divina. Lectio Divina is a way of kind of meditating, dwelling on the Word. I'm going to show you dwelling on the Word, which is also very similar to Lectio Divina. And we're going to do one other practice if we have time. Because I want to teach you tools so that this is no longer intimidating to you. Like, you'll be willing to grab it and not just do one verse at a time, but actually dive in and see what it says. Okay? Yes?
You're talking about different timelines. Have you heard of, or do you have, or has anybody heard of, there's a Bible circle out there now, where it gives you the whole timeline of the history of the Bible and the different characters, and then it also has, like historical figures throughout history, and it kind of ties them all together through history.
That's very cool. I haven't seen that, but I'm sure that's out there. There's another Bible called there's actually a Lectio Divina Bible, which Pastor Jim just ordered. There's a rainbow Bible now that highlights, like as you read it, if it's pink, it's historical. If it's purple, it's prophetic. And it helps you to keep these genres that I pointed out in the top of your mind so that you know what you're reading. So like prophecy is fun to read because we now know those prophetic stories pretty well in the New Testament. So you can see how it comes to fruition. It just makes it all more real, if you will. All right, I wish we had more time. I would love to dive in, but that's that for today. I'll leave these books here in case anybody wants to look through them and see what the difference is. You're more than welcome to always do that.
Are we pre or post tribulation?
I don't know what you mean by that exactly. That could be loaded. I'm not going to answer with certainty.